Hi and welcome. In this video I'd like to expand on an article that I recently read about 20 ways that the Beatles changed the world. And the article was written by Evan Sawdey, who raised some interesting points, so credit to him for that article. In the article he pointed out that Chuck Klosterman, the American author and essayist his work focused on American popular culture, once came out with a list of bands who weren't overrated or underrated, but were just properly rated. Now, Klosterman summed up the Beatles with 2 points. The Beatles were generally seen as the single most important rock band of all time, and they wrote all the best songs. Since both of these facts are probably true, Klosterman rated the Beatles properly. It's funny because it makes me think of the middle ground between underwhelmed and overwhelmed. Sometimes we can just be whelmed, right? So the Beatles then aren't under or overrated, they're just rated. The Beatles did a few things better than their peers, and even did a few things no one had yet conceived of. So let's take a look at how some of those things the Beatles did changed the world and the pop culture. They created the first ever rock music videos. Now, before the days of MTV and music videos, most music artists would have their performances filmed on pre-built sets of either late night shows or variety shows, but outside of that, the best place to catch them would be in concert or on the radio. In the Beatles' first film, A Hard Day's Night, certain sequences were designed to highlight certain songs, such as I Should Have Known Better, which was filmed in the carriage of the train. If I Fell, filmed in the studio while the scenes were being set up. 'Cause I couldn't stand the pain, and Can't Buy Me Love sees the lads fooling around in the field. And I Love Her was a proper promo video, if you ask me, and of course She Loves You set as concert footage, but obviously choreographed. But the Beatles would push the idea of art and marketing even further and filmed their own performance clips for Day Tripper and We Can Work It Out. Now, these standalone audience-free film experimentation videos centered around new songs, and the films would predict the music video era. They led the charge of the British invasion, giving rise to a new type of British pop culture. Before the British invasion, there was good old-fashioned rock and roll. While many point to the likes of Elvis and Little Richards as acts that kickstart the worldwide obsession with rock and roll genre, British kids were growing up on these records and eventually wanted to make their own music. So in late 1963, the Beatles' popularity proved so overwhelming that news programs ran stories on them.
Yeah. Those are the Beatles, those are. And this is Beatleland, formerly known as Britain, where an epidemic called Beatlemania has seized the teenage population, especially female.
Following their legendary Ed Sullivan show performance in 1964, America was consumed by Beatlemania, which actually kicked open the floodgates for acts like the Kinks, the Rolling Stones, Dusty Springfield, and The Who, all of whom made inroads into the global pop culture. Now, Liverpool would quickly become a popular tourist destination, generating a global fascination with everything British. They broke the rules on what album covers could look like. Now, in the early days of the recording industry, album covers would often be a photo of the artist accompanied by some text. Maybe there'd be kind of a landscape scene if it was a classical record, but by and large, LP artwork was pretty predictable. the Beatles would create many iconic album covers, which in themselves would be as much of an art form as the music contained on the albums. While the Bloody Butcher cover of the 1966 compilation Yesterday and Today would prove too extreme for the times, the line-drawn art for Revolver and the pop collage for Sgt. Pepper's changed notions of what could be done with the album cover medium. So pushing the boundaries even further, the Beatles' 1968's self-titled double LP was given the most radical cover album yet, nothing but a white blank surface. This became such a cultural touchstone that people still call this record the White Album. Now I'm reminded of the line from the Dire Straits song In the Gallery.
Like the stakes on empty canvas, sticks it on the wall.
Is it art though? You know, a blank canvas. Shut up. It's a case of the Emperor's New Clothes, if you ask me. They were masters at marketing. At the peak of Beatlemania, merchandise of John, Paul, George and Ringo was rampant and remains hugely collectible to this day. Even after they disbanded in 1970, the band's company, Apple Corps Limited, managed to usher in their legacy into so many new ways. For each new decade, they found unique and innovative ways to bring the group's sound to a whole new generation of listeners. The mid-90s saw the release of the three-part anthology series and documentary showing fans tons of outtakes and behind-the-scenes footage.
The good thing about the anthology and the CDs is that it's four of us. Now, even though John's not here, he's here.
The 2000 compilation One put all of their chart topper hits onto a single CD, selling over 31 million copies. In 2006, their Cirque du Soleil show Love premiered.
Attracts me like no other lover.
And in 2021, there was something new to say because Peter Jackson's Get Back documentary won universal acclaim for showing sides of the band that hadn't been seen before, using raw footage omitted from the original Let It Be film. So it seems that even if you think you know their catalogue and their story, there will always be new facets to market and repackage. It's the men in suits, isn't it? So how else can we get some money from the Beatles? They would use their platform to advance political causes. While rock music could sometimes be viewed as anti-establishment, the Beatles used their platform to explore political themes, from somewhat tongue-in-cheek songs like Back in the USSR and Taxman to genuinely heartfelt songs like Blackbird, which is often viewed through the lens of contemporary civil rights movement. Now, John Lennon's solo career and marriage to Yoko Ono turned him into an activist, wielding his celebrity status to highlight injustices and causes that were close to his heart. They changed how records were produced. By 1966, the Beatles retired from touring fairly early in their career, which was surprising given how financially lucrative touring tends to be. But when you think they'd been doing the touring for 6 years, and that's counting the grueling Hamburg years, it's no wonder they'd had enough. Instead, with the help of George Martin, the band would start treating the recording studio like another instrument, finding new ways to create never-before-heard sounds. They reversed instrument tracks, dampened the drums, made multi-layered vocals at wild tones, and used various instruments not often used in Western pop recordings. So their willingness to experiment sonically further highlighted how good the songs were structurally. So many songs and recordings from other artists that you hear today is probably indebted to the Beatles' innovation, whether it's Make Us Know It or not. They starred in and soundtracked movies that rewrote the rules of rock cinema. Rock stars and movies were nothing new when the Beatles hit the big time. Ricky Nelson's screen presence was turned into chart-topping success on his parents' TV show, Ozzie and Harriet.
The Nelsons, Ozzy, Harriet, David, and Ricky.
Where his parents pushed Ricky's singing career relentlessly on the show. It got to the point where they would race through the storyline so that Ricky had 5 minutes at the end to sing his latest song. Elvis Presley's movies came out dime a dozen and have often been criticised as mostly throwaway nonsense.
What's your name?
Deke.
Deke?
Deke Rivers.
Short for Deacon?
I guess.
Poor old Elvis. But moviegoers still showed up and bought the soundtracks. But 1963's A Hard Day's Night went one step further than Elvis's filmography, as the Beatles played the Beatles, but in heightened, fictionalized versions of themselves, showcasing their goofy personalities and comic timing.
I now declare this bridge open.
It didn't hurt that the resulting soundtrack was considered one of their finest pre-Rubber Soul offerings, and the film has since changed how rock musicians and cinema are intertwined. They stuck their necks out for racial justice. In 1964, the Beatles were to play the Gator Bowl in Jacksonville, Florida, but initially refused when they found out that the crowd would be segregated. Lennon stated, "We never play to segregated audiences, and we aren't going to start now. I'd sooner lose our appearance money." The venue ultimately relented and allowed the crowd to mix, but the Beatles didn't stop there. Often covering Motown hits and citing their love of great soul singers in the press, the band requested the legendary Mary Wells to open for them during the UK dates. Later, Esther Phillips joined them for dates following the success of her cover, And I Love Him. They rewrote the rules of pop music success. April the 4th, 1964, a date etched in history. That's the day the Beatles pulled off the unprecedented feat of occupying the top 5 slots of the Billboard Hot 100. Around this time in Australia, they occupied 6 slots of the top 10. And during 1 week in Canada, it was 9 of those 10 slots. They routinely ended most years during their existence as a band by having the UK's best-selling album and shattering attendance records during the years that they were touring. They created their own record label, upending the established record industry. While the Fab Four were famously associated with Capitol Records and EMI, you don't become a world-conquering force like the Beatles without some glorious caveats. One of them is the creation of Apple Records, a home that allowed them to get as creative as they wanted without having to answer to the men in suits. While Apple Records housed Beatles projects, it also allowed the group to help prop up what they viewed as deserving talent.
We want to set up a system whereby people who just want to make a film about anything don't have to go on their knees in somebody's office, probably yours.
Giving a major platform to the likes of Mary Hopkin, friend of the band Billy Preston, the amazing Badfinger, and one young folk artist named James Taylor. They helped push the avant-garde into the mainstream with their experiments and wild collaborators. As much as the Beatles experimented in the recording studio to produce some out there sounds and textures, they didn't stop at mere pop songs. They would go to the furthest reaches of known genre, culminating in the release of 1968's Revolution 9, an 8-minute avant-garde slice of sounds found in the EMI archives housed on the White Album. Revolution 9 confounded many and delighted even more. It was a hard right turn for the group, already bending their creativity into new shapes. But when released on an album, for a group as popular as the Beatles, it too etched itself into public consciousness, elevating the status of Lennon's known muse Yoko Ono, and soon introducing the world to genres that maybe they had not known about. They became unintentional fashion icons. As part of their initial uniform, the Beatles wore Baba boots. Once Beatlemania was in full swing, the 4 Liverpool lads with their mop-top hair started noticing a bunch of fans getting similar haircuts as well as sporting similar styled clothes and boots. That Baba boot was soon colloquially rekindled as the Beatle boot because everybody wanted to wear them. Well, I say everyone. Blokes, right? Once their boy band era slowly phased out, each member began adopting his own distinct style and look, setting clothing and fashion trends every decade. Their world-curious ways helped bring new instruments into the cultural conversation. The Beatles' trip to India has been widely accepted as a large turning point for their sound, aesthetic, and overall direction. George Harrison in particular became fascinated by the sitar. While he signed and produced Ravi Shankar for Apple Records, it was Harrison's use of the sitar on Norwegian wood that proved to be a gateway for Western audiences. Similarly, Harrison was one of the first people in the UK to get their hands on a powerful new thing called a Moog synthesizer. Some call it Moog. I'm going to call it Moog. While its function was archaic, apparently you could only hold down a single note at a time, it was still used prominently on legendary tracks like Here Comes the Sun and I Want You, She's So Heavy. The use of the mellotron on Strawberry Fields Forever also shook up the popular instrument repertoire of bass, drums, one or two guitars, and maybe an organ or a piano. They redefined what a solo career could be after departing a band. Before the Beatles, solo careers outside of bands weren't really a thing. You were either a member of a band or a solo artist from the start. Once the Beatles disbanded, their sheer popularity and cultural goodwill helped propel each of them into solo success. Ringo released the first album in March 1970, and Paul McCartney's came out a few weeks before the final Beatles record, Let It Be, released in May 1970. Harrison's All Things Must Pass arrived in November that year, and Lennon's debut effort with the Plastic Ono Band was released in December. Even more remarkable is how all their solo successes were unique. Ringo was the goofy country pop troubadour, and Harrison paved new ground with his distinct and emotive songwriting. Lennon alternated in equal measure between trashy joke songs and earnest pleas, while McCartney was the rock and roll chameleon, changing with the times and netting hits even into the 2010s. They created one of the first true rock and roll concept albums. For the longest time, rock and roll pop records were considered a collection of potential singles, nothing too fancy and rarely, if ever, thematic. This changed in the 50s when Frank Sinatra started releasing records like In the Wee Small Hours, in which all songs had a consistent melancholy tone. The Beach Boys' Pet Sound proved to lead the rock era into the land of the concept album, with a record that proved to be somewhat autobiographical, but Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band was a quantum leap ahead of anybody else. With the band playing a band that wasn't themselves, this setup was far more intricate in the caricatures they portrayed in A Hard Day's Night. Ringo played the leading vocalist role of Billy Shears, but he was just one part of a strange intertwining narrative that would be hard to understand were it not for the album containing some of the best songs ever recorded. They changed the way rock music was critically assessed. While Elvis, the Supremes, and the Beatles are now considered the building blocks upon which all popular music was built, this wasn't always the case. Music critics existed well before the 1956 song 5 O'Clock Rock hit the airwaves, but they weren't reviewing rock and roll before this genre was established. Elvis was popular but easy to dismiss because of his awkward film career. But once the Beatles arrived, it was impossible to ignore their incredible sense of craft. The Beatles scored the first ever Album of the Year nomination at the Grammys for Help, and were the first rock act ever to win the award for Sgt. Pepper's. With the British invasion came the rise of the rock critic, and it's those same critics that help keep the Beatles' legacy well afloat. Some of them probably get a hand in suggesting the nominees for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. But I'll leave that commentary to Michael Nolan's Bottom Line. Go and check his channel out, link up here. They helped usher in the counterculture movement. In August 1964, the Beatles met Bob Dylan and then introduced the Beatles to weed. The counterculture movement of the 60s was starting to spread, and while hippies sought to obtain a higher consciousness, so did the Beatles. It started out with the boppy jaunt called The Word from 1965's Rubber Soul that expressed their earnest plea for universal love. But that soon expanded into trippy songs with ornate instrumentation and even the almost too strange for words animated film Yellow Submarine. As the use of psychedelics started to become popular, the Beatles were right in the middle of it, giving the fans the best soundtracks for tripping and wild visuals to match. They were unafraid to court controversy and showed the world how to overcome it. When you're the biggest band on the planet, everything you do and say is held up under a microscope, and John Lennon's offhanded comment in the spring of '66 about how the Beatles were becoming more popular than Jesus sparked outrage.
I'm not saying that we're better or greater or comparing us with Jesus Christ as a person or God as a thing or whatever it is. You know, I just said what I said and it was wrong.
In his original quote and subsequent press conference, Lennon never implied that the Beatles were more important than Jesus, but the protests happened nonetheless. So while controversy and rock certainly aren't strangers to each other, Lennon's remarks proved how big the Beatles actually were and showed us how much pressure they could withstand. Their Ed Sullivan taping caused a cultural shift. The Ed Sullivan Theatre in Studio 50 holds 728 audience members for a live taping. When Elvis Presley performed in 1957, CBS received over 7,000 requests for tickets. When the Beatles were set to appear in 1964, the studio received over 50,000 requests. Demand was huge, but the impact was bigger than anyone could have anticipated. Over 73 million people tuned in to the broadcast, and for many, the mania energy and charm that burst out of the TV screens flicked a switch in their brains that made them want to become rock stars. 73 million is a lot. I'm lucky to get 500 views on my videos. I could be a worldwide phenomena with 73 million views. In fact,
I could, dare I say it, rule the world.
Billy Joel, Nancy Wilson, Tom Petty, and so many more have cited that specific broadcast as the reason they wanted to get into music in the first place. They upended the established notion that B-sides were lesser songs. In the early rock eras, there were albums, there were singles, and there were B-sides. Whilst albums and singles were sometimes separate entities, radio made the single more important, and most albums would also contain the singles, but maybe not those throwaway recordings deemed kind of unworthy or unworthy enough to be included on an album. The Beatles counteracted that narrative by putting some of their best work on the backs of giant radio smashes, creating a secret discography that ran parallel to their main one. Sure, their double A-sides were wildly successful, but the list of B-side songs contained such gems as I Saw Her Standing There, Don't Let Me Down, Revolution, Rain, and You Know My Name, Look Up My Number. It's likely that in the decades that have passed, every single record or track recorded by the Beatles has become a treasure, and none are regarded as throwaway. The Beatle-loving public just can't get enough. Maybe even one day soon, more unheard Beatles material will be unearthed in the vaults of some recording studio. Because EMI never threw anything away, right? Or any recording that the Beatles made was never taped over. That would be a treat, wouldn't it? So in conclusion then, All in all, I think the music industry has much to thank the Beatles for, in wanting and getting their own way in turning music into an art and cultural phenomenon is a credit to their tenacity. Drop me a comment. Let's interact. Did the article miss anything out? I kind of liked it as it brought some new information and highlights some things I'd forgotten about. So thanks to Evan Sawdey for posting that. Just a short one, I think. Thanks for watching and bearing with, and I'll see you in another one. Bye for now.